1:32.
And I'm going to start the recording of the meeting as well, Alex.
Okay. And Deborah, do you want to do the roll call?
I sure will. All right, Alex Todd.
Here.
Kate Hall.
Here.
Karen Key. I see you, Karen. I know you're here.
Yeah, I'm here, sorry.
Jeff Ray.
Here.
Ann Finstad. I believe Ann couldn't make it today, so she won't be here. Linda Kahn.
Here.
Molly Brumbaugh.
Yep.
Jessica Thompson.
Here.
Brian Wilson. Okay. Sarah Kaminsky. And then Ariane Carey.
Here.
Okay, and then I believe we also have a couple of guests here. Oh, and Violet. I'm sorry, Violet, I missed you.
It's okay, I'm here.
You here, and it looks like we do have a couple of guests. Sarah Scodius from Northbrook, Rachel Fisher from CCS. I see Rebecca Malinowski is here as well from CCS. Jamie King from Niles. And I think that covers it. Oh, and Michelle Walters from ELA.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us.
Point of clarification. Sorry, Alex. Just a point. I think that Rachel was showing up as Rebecca, so I don't think Rebecca is actually here.
Oh, I see that.
I think Rachel is Rebecca. So just so we have the minutes right.
Double duty, Rachel. You were Rebecca for a few moments there. All right, we just have Rachel. We do not have Rebecca here.
I didn't change my name soon enough.
Okay, did everybody have an opportunity to review the revised meeting minutes from November?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes from the November 2020 meeting as presented.
I'm not taking motions. I'm asking if anybody has any further questions or changes about the minutes. Hearing none, I will declare the minutes approved by unanimous consent.
Oh, Alex, I see what you did there, and I like it.
As with all things. And then moving on to the request for additional stat item codes. We get to act on this. We talked about this a little bit in November, and I'll turn it back over to Deborah to.
Perfect. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me 1 minute. Okay. Give me 1 second. All right. So the first, as Alex mentioned, the first item we have up on our agenda today is a request for some new item stat codes. Before we begin that discussion, I wanted to take a little bit of time to review some guiding questions that we can use to help us evaluate both the item stat code request as well as our discussion on forthcoming title records. So back in 2018, Database Management and CCS drafted some guiding questions to help us through our discussions on new policy requests. So we're going to review those questions together before, again, we jump right into those new item stat code requests that we received. So the first two questions we want to consider are, is there overlap with existing policies already in place? And do these items need to be treated uniquely from our existing collections? So these two questions help us determine need for a new policy. So for example, do we need a youth book material type, or does the existing book material type adequately cover both youth and adult materials? So again, these first two questions are just evaluating, is there a need for something new in our database or in our policies? Now, the next two questions are evaluating impact. So how does this change affect the patron experience? And how does this change affect the staff experience? And we talked a lot last meeting about patron experience versus staff experience. And both of those pieces are very important when it comes to evaluating new requests. Now, the next couple questions are evaluating, short-term and long-term impact. So does this policy have longevity? Are we introducing a new policy or rule that is for short-term, or is this a policy that will again have long-term impact and be applicable over the long term versus a short period of time? Now, next we have some questions that address consortial implications. Will there be widespread adoption of the policy across the consortia, and will libraries be required to use the new policy? Or again, is this an opt-in policy we're adding? And then lastly, we want to think, of course, about maintenance. So will retro or ongoing maintenance be required if we're introducing a new policy? And then who will be responsible for completing that? Will it be CCS staff, or will it be individual libraries? So again, we have these 9 questions that we can keep in mind as we're reviewing and thinking about these policy requests that CCS has received. So does anyone have any questions on any of those? And we'll revisit them on a later slide, but any questions right now before we jump in? Okay, all right. So let's talk about our new item stat code request that we've received. So just a quick bit of background information on item stat codes. They are item descriptions that are used to enhance reports. So these were designed to work in conjunction with some of the other item fields in Polaris to help provide additional reporting opportunities for library staff. So keep in mind, item stat codes do not impact Polaris functionality. So they don't impact how many items a patron can check out, what patrons can put on hold. They're purely designed for reporting purposes. So I have an example here of what an item stat code would look like in an item record. Here we have a DVD of the Magnificent Seven. So you can see here that this library is using a statistical code of Western, which provides them the opportunity to report on genre for their DVD collection. So this library, it looks like it's Huntley. Their call number is only reflecting the title, and the shelf location is just DVDs. So for Huntley, they're using the item stat code to apply a genre to this DVD. That way they can later run reports on their various AV genres if they need to. So we received a request both from ELA to add 2 new item statistical codes. The first one is realistic. So ELA is, and Michelle's here, so Michelle, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but ELA is shifting towards genrifying some of their youth and adult collections. So for their youth collections, they already use CCS stat codes of historical, fantasy, mystery, and science fiction. So they're requesting a realistic stat code to help complement, again, those genre stat codes that we already have in place that they're taking advantage of. Now, the second request that we received was for a crime stat code. ELA, and it sounds like a couple other libraries, are combining their mystery and suspense collections into a single crime collection. And so they like to take advantage of a crime stat code. I know that CCS does currently already have suspense, thriller, and mystery stat codes. So I wanted to make sure you had that information. So I'd like to open it up for discussion on these 2 additions.
Deborah, is there any limit to the number of stat codes that we can have?
There's, in Polaris, there's no limit. Any limits we have are self-imposed by CCS, but we can theoretically add as many stat codes as we'd like to. Previously in CIRCE, we had, I believe, like about 2,000 different fields that we combined to make, I think, the 226 that we currently have now in Polaris.
And we don't want to go back to 2000, that's for sure. I just wanted to know, if by adding more, we were limiting ourselves in the future. So that was kind of the first question.
Yeah, we're not limiting ourselves, but again, we do want to make sure we keep the database nice and tidy. So when possible, we'd like to, I think, avoid adding extraneous stat codes or adding duplicate stat codes for libraries. So all libraries do share these, so we don't add branch-specific item stat codes at this time. So every new stat code we add, all libraries will see that option appear in their drop-downs when they're creating item records.
So can I zoom us out for just a second
Yes.
and talk about item statistical codes just in general? So when I was reviewing the list of all the item stat codes, I noticed that there was a lot of duplication. And so I wonder, how much do we know about how these are actually being used and whether or not these are actually helping? I mean, I think ELA's requesting them because it sounds like they are, but are we trying to just allow individual libraries to run reports that are very specific to them? Or are we trying to create item stat codes that then could compare like how many mysteries Northbrook has versus how many mysteries ELA has? And that would not allow us to do this. So I guess, you know, and I know Deborah, just full disclosure, Deborah and I talked a little bit before this meeting because I was having these thoughts. I feel like the item stat codes aren't where they need to be in terms of us understanding how different libraries are using them and how the catalogers are using them versus how potentially people in the departments are using them to run reports. Are they even using them? Are these actually helping people? And are we spending a lot of time doing this and is it actually helping us run better reports? Now, we at Northbrook have very specific shelf locations, so we can run a lot of reports off of those. So like, we're very lucky. But this feels messy to me, and I know that I'm not going to propose that we don't talk about what ELA would like right now and suggest that we redo the item stat codes, but I do think that this is something that database management should look more deeply at, and I would love to see perhaps some user interviews and some design thinking processes around this that Kathleen could maybe do down the road, because I don't know how helpful this actually is. And I can speak, well, I mean, I'm not gonna, but like Sarah Kaminsky and I talked about like, do we know if our selectors are actually using this? And Sarah's like, I have no idea. So.
Well, and I'd like to hear from ELA as to why they feel a new stat code is required versus, as Kate was just saying, perhaps a shelf location for their, to carve out their collection or their genrefying.
We did add new shelf locations for crime fiction and realistic fiction. To be honest, I wasn't totally sure if a new stat code was necessary. So when I approached Deborah about it, we kind of talked over the process, and she let me know that if we were going to add a new stat code, it would be presented to database management. So I'm totally fine if this gets like downvoted. I totally agree with some of your concerns about it ending up being messy if too many are added or if they're not correctly used. I know at ELA, it would only be tech services that's using the stat codes. Our selectors don't use them at all. They don't even know what stat codes are, which is problematic in a different way.
So how do you use them at ELA, Michelle?
I run reports using stat codes. Like Western is a good example. That's one that we don't have a Western shelf location. So I can run a Western stat code report and pull out anything that is of that genre.
So do you use it for like database cleanup projects or for, I mean, obviously statistical, or for like getting a list so that they can do displays? Like, I'm trying to understand like how these might be used.
Sure. Yeah, it's mainly the examples that you use. Like we did do a Western display at one point, and it was easiest for me to do a Western stat code and pull books and movies that fall into that genre. I mean, It's a lot easier to search by shelf location, obviously, especially because we can really get more detailed shelf locations than stat codes.
I want to inject here as someone from youth services that genreification of the picture book collection is a kind of it's not new, but it tends to be gaining momentum. So I think this also perhaps would be seen as a potential tool for youth collections to, you know, not necessarily lean into changing the call number, because that's a whole undertaking that's not only in the database, but also a physical change where you have to go and change the spine labels for everything. But that not to say if you open this up, youth services will be like, ooh, here's another tool we can use. But that this is not currently, I don't think, seen as a tool. And if it's easy as this to add a list of new ones, I think you're going to have some interested youth service departments wanting to add their genreification stat codes.
And
just to put that in there.
yeah, Ariane, for youth services, do you typically have shelf locations that would match with genres, or are they a little more pared down?
They're super pared down. I mean, I think Jamie, correct me if I'm wrong, I think in youth services we're fiction, the nonfiction, readers. Jamie, you want to jump in? He's got the better picture. I do know that, yeah, one shelf location. So this is not a tool that we use in searching. However, I think when we came to Polaris, there was a sense of loss as using the database as a searching tool to pick out these smaller collections, which in Niles, we saw this as an opportunity to kind of reverse the tide because we had so many pull-out collections. So it's just still getting used to these new settings.
So I'm kind of concerned with Molly was talking about with having this as a limitless proposition. 226 stat codes seems like a lot to me right now, but I can see if there's always going to be another one that someone wants to add in on. I wonder if we as a committee shouldn't take a look at current stat codes, get requests for new stat codes, and kind of come up with a revised list that eliminates ones that are not used currently. And I'm sure there's probably not that many, because I know that was a big emphasis that we had when we culled the 2,000 down to 200. I'd be very leery of just opening this up to individual library requests and then handling them, because then we will have 350, then 500, then 750, then whatever. And then all of a sudden we're looking at an unwieldy list that many of us are not really using in any way. So, what do we think of that? Just keeping this here within the committee, taking the requests from ELA and any others who want to have new stat items established, review the list that we currently have, scrub that, and make sure that the stat items that are on the list are being used, and then maybe work with Deborah to come up with a standard for how much use a stat item needs to stay on the list before it just kind of goes, High Plains Western should just be Western, or something along those lines. Because again, the more that we have on this, the less effective it's going to be, because we're not going to be able to use them all. We're not going to be able to run reports that have the comparable qualities that we want, because they're going to have high Plains Westerns and low Plains Westerns, and those are not going to be able to match.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that we do have these available for libraries to use, but implementation is inconsistent across the consortia. So if we were to revise this list in a way that, again, would make comparable reporting across libraries possible, we would also need to implement guidelines and policies and rules that said you have to use them and you have to use them in this way. So I am not sure if there is a desire across the consortia to enforce statistical codes on that level, to say, again, you have to use them in this way. I think originally they, again, were designed to allow some comparable reporting when, again, we have very different call numbers, shelf locations, and so on. But creating a list and paring it down would also require, again, making sure that it's implemented across all CCS libraries in a way that's consistent. If that's the goal with item stat codes, is to say, you can run a report at Northbrook to compare your collection to Nile. So again, it's not just the evaluation of the list, but then the enforcement of the application of them that we need to talk about too.
And I would also argue that we don't even know that people want to be comparing library to library. Maybe it is very item specific and that every library gets, say, 10, item stat codes that they define for themselves and use. And maybe it doesn't have to be across. So I don't feel like we know enough about how people are using them. But now that we've been in Polaris for a few years, I think people have a better sense. We couldn't have had this discussion when we were migrating, but I think it is a discussion that we could have and look at down the, next year, because I think we have the information now and better understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, we couldn't at all do that comparative reporting on Circe, on Symphony, because everyone had their own unique fields that they used. So we thought, hey, we want to do this. This will be helpful. And maybe 2 years down there, maybe it's not. Maybe libraries don't want to compare collections library to library in this very specific way that stat codes were designed to. So I do think that having some conversations about that field in general, like what do we do with it? What's its purpose? It would be really helpful. In the short term though, how do we feel about, again, this request for these 2 new stat codes? Do we want to say we're going to table creation of any new stat codes until we do this big analysis of them, or do we want to again discuss them here today?
I think wants us to vote, can certainly put it in the request, but it seems to me that
Dude, Alex,
know what.
Alex, you're super breaking up.
Oh. Sorry, is this better? I'm holding the mic.
Yes.
So, Violet was saying that she didn't know what the stat codes are used for. Kate has kind of said that too, but she's a director and I'm a director, so we're not supposed to really know what they're for. The general consensus is that we have these things, nobody's really used them. So I think maybe if we take the time and get the catalogers group and maybe the PAS group to have on this to see how they want to use it, and then we can take a look back next year and do it. So does that make sense?
That makes sense. Catalogers, how do you guys feel about that? I feel like item records are your territory. I don't hear any other discussion from the group. Michelle, it does sound like in the short term you do have shelf locations that you can use to track statistics for these items. So it does sound like the group feels that we should table this discussion so we can have an overall evaluation of item stat codes as a whole.
Do you want us to do an official motion to table?
I suppose it can't hurt.
All right, then
Well, we don't do motion to table. We're just not. Because we don't need a motion. We're not taking formal action.
Except that we're specifically not taking action? So then this will just keep coming up on every single agenda and we'll have to rehash it out?
No, it'll come back on the agenda when we're ready to hash it out in a year.
Okay.
I mean, we talked about it, nothing happened. We can certainly have a vote to, on Michelle's request to add it, and I think it would probably fail. And if you want to move to table it, we certainly can. But I think if there's just, for me, I always view something as tabling as until next month or 2 months within a reasonable time frame. But we're talking, 10 to 15 months down the road, and no one's going to remember that we tabled anything because we're not going to be, this composition of this committee is going to be different, and it's not going to matter. Deborah's just going to put it on the agenda.
I think in my mind, I would rather not table this for an entire year. I think that we can, with the same committee, begin our initial investigation to item stat codes in the first half of the calendar year 2020. So our next meeting's in February, and then I believe we meet again in May. So I feel like this group could continue to have this discussion. So Alex and Kate, whatever you feel is appropriate, whether it's a motion or again, we're tabling to the next meeting. I'm happy to follow your advice.
Alex is in charge, so we'll go with what he says.
Yeah, I think we have, Deborah has her marching orders on it. I don't think we need a formal action to do that.
So then, just to recap, we'll do a soft investigation into how people use the item stat codes at different libraries. Based on that information, we'll discuss what use they are serving in different libraries and what actions we might want to take to make them more useful. And then after that discussion, we'll move forward in looking at the realistic and crime recommendations from ELA.
And any additional requests that we may get in between.
I just wanted to say thank you to the committee for considering and for some insight into how this works.
Okay. Thank you for summarizing that, Kate, and thank you for joining us, Michelle. Moving on to the next item, forthcoming title records. 60 minutes of discussion. We'll turn this back over to Deborah.
Don't make us nervous, Alex. All right, I am going to hop back over to my PowerPoint. Give me just 1 minute. Okay, so here we are. We are going to continue the discussion of forthcoming title records that we started last meeting in November. So just to provide a really quick overview, go back. The forthcoming title question is one that was brought to CCS by Palatine. And the question we're trying to answer is, should CCS allow our libraries to add records for future titles that are not yet available for purchase? So an example of a forthcoming title would be a streaming TV show that's not available yet in physical format. So again, it's streaming on Hulu or Amazon Prime. Patrons want it, but the library can't buy it on DVD or Blu-ray yet because it's not been made available by the producer. Another example could be a movie in the theater that isn't available for pre-order yet, or the next James Patterson. So an upcoming title that maybe is being marketed by a publisher, but again, the library cannot yet pre-order it in Baker & Taylor or Ingram because it's not actually available for pre-sale yet. So to recap the discussion we had at our November meeting, we talked about the pros and cons of forthcoming title records for both staff and for patron. We reviewed some of the feedback from Scrap, Pass, and Acquisitions. And ultimately at the end of that discussion, we decided that we needed more information before we could come to a decision. So some of the additional information that we said we would need was, what do other consortia do? We heard from Karen that she's worked at a standalone that successfully has managed this practice, but what does that look like in a consortial environment, and has anyone done it successfully? We said that we needed a sample workflow and then just a sample bib standard of what that could look like, though of course if this were to pass, we'd take this back to scrap and the catalogers to finalize any standards we would come up with. We needed some information from Palatine, some answers to some questions that we had for them. And then we thought that we needed some more information on holds placing practices by our patrons. We didn't want to make assumptions about how patrons place holds, so we maybe needed some more data on how holds practices work across the consortia. So I reached out to our consortia friends at Swan, Pinnacle, Prairie Cat, and RSA to see, do they currently allow for this type of record? So interestingly, Swan, they recently received a request for something similar from one of their new members, and they ultimately decided that they would not allow them to add these kinds of records. The library's practice was to add records to the database for, again, the next James Patterson, the next Janet Ivanovich, and Swan decided that the logistics of trying to monitor and move holds from these forthcoming or these pre-records over to the real record when it was finally cataloged was just too much to manage in a consortial environment. Again, this brought up questions of like, how do you transfer holds correctly if there's multiple editions, if there's multiple formats that are ultimately released, whose libraries patrons can place holds on these records, and again, who would handle that work. So Swan received a similar request and decided not to move forward with that new practice. Pinnacle does not do something similar. Libraries add records for titles that are available for pre-order. So they do not add new records until they actually order the item. Prairie Cat is the only consortia that said they allowed something like this. Their libraries can add short records. However, those records are deleted after 45 days if the title's not ordered. So they allow libraries to create these records temporarily, and then if it's not ordered, Prairie Cat centrally deletes those after 45 days. And RSA is the last consortia, and they do not currently allow this practice. So next, we had some questions for Palatine. And anyone, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to jump in and interrupt me. We had some questions for Palatine, and Violet kindly provided some answers for us. So we asked Palatine, roughly how many forthcoming titles do they add to the database per month? And they estimate they add about 5 to 10 movie titles monthly, and they rarely add book or print titles. So primarily they create these for AV, for movies. We asked if there were any titles or formats that they won't add forthcoming title records to. So they say typically they wouldn't add forthcoming records for nonfiction or documentary movies unless requested, as well as limited release movie titles and then foreign film movie titles. And Violet, feel free to jump in if you have any corrections to your answers. We also asked, do they have information on how many holds queue up on these records before the item can be ordered from a vendor? And they said that holds for very popular titles can go a little over 100. However, those lesser known authors and films might only have 1 or 2 holds by the time they're actually able to be ordered from a vendor. So it varies depending on popularity. And then the last question was about how many forthcoming titles have to be deleted or canceled because the item's never released. They didn't have a number to give us. However, they noted that, of course, this would happen more often with titles that are released on streaming services like Amazon and like Hulu, which makes sense. Okay, any questions? Violet's here today, so does anyone have any questions for Palatine before we jump into some holds placing data?
Violet, this is Kate at Northbrook. Could you just remind us, I know that this was shared at some point and I just can't remember, how long you guys have been doing this practice?
Sure. Well, to the best of my knowledge, because I've actually only been at Palatine since September 9th. So
right.
There's a little bit of a learning curve there. But I came from Arlington, Heights, and we did the same thing. From my understanding, it's been for quite a long time, so I'm sort of guessing, but it's definitely been several years.
Okay.
I would say from the conversations I would have, I would guess at least 5 years that they've been doing this.
Okay.
And yeah, I wanted to kind of pop in too about how many are deleted and canceled. Part of the reason we didn't give a number is that first of all, it isn't something they've been tracking. So, you know, it would have just been sort of a guess, but also that has been increasing because there are a lot more Amazon Prime shows that just never come out on DVD, something like that. You know, like if we had created one for The Mandalorian, we'd be sad.
All right, any other questions? Ariane, I see you raise your hand.
Sure. So just I was just going back and looking at the original survey for the technical services and the patron service groups who answered the initial survey. And so I'm going to phrase one of the questions. I'm going to phrase this question as one of those questions was phrased. If Palatine was told that this was not going to work going forward, how would you adjust? How would you serve those patrons within the parameters, the current parameters of our process?
Right. I mean, ultimately, we would, you know, that we've tried to say through the whole process that we want to be all in on CCS. We want to do what works for everybody. You know, so if this doesn't work for everybody and it's decided we can't do it, then we would just need to communicate really clearly to our patrons that this is in the long term to their benefit because they're getting access to all this other material, but that unfortunately we won't be able to do this for them anymore, and we might need some wording for specific requests because people are so used to us just doing it. You know, and that's something that would be an adjustment period for our patrons. But you know, we totally understand that this is a group effort. Whatever works best for the group is what we are going to adhere to.
So I should have asked these questions in reverse order, but the current practice is that a patron walks up to the service desk and says, I would like to put the Mandalorian on hold. And the librarian who's the first person to receive that request is writing this down manually and submitting it to, I mean, is that, what's that process? If so, the first person to ask?
Sure. We do have an online form, which is for requests for purchase, which is the most common way we're getting these requests. If someone walks up to a desk and just tells a service librarian, they will refer them to that form. And if the person doesn't want to fill out the form, they'll do it for them. So it's pretty much all coming through that web form on our website, which again, we could add the wording that we no longer accept requests for items that aren't currently available for purchase. You know, because we don't have any wording about that. We don't have any wording at all on that form about this process. People just kind of make the assumption, they go ahead and submit it, and then we create a record and put them on hold.
Okay. But this probably wouldn't change if the decision today is to not engage in this practice. It probably would not necessarily affect your process in-house because those people are still going to want to put the items on hold. You're just not physically entering it in the catalog until the item is available for purchase.
That would be a discussion because I'm wondering, and right now the assumption is we would just put some wording on there and say we no longer accept requests for items that, you know, are not available for purchase. My concern long term, having been at Arlington Heights for 7 years and seeing how people get kind of worked up about this sort of stuff, is that my assumption we may have a lot of backlash. And then I'm wondering if our service desk staff may want to put something into place to create a potential holds list for, you know, when something may be ready. That could get kind of messy, and I'm kind of hoping they don't, but I have heard discussions about potentially doing something like that in-house, but that wouldn't actually be in my department. That would be the selectors, that would be the service desk librarians who would have to track that, and then they would just have to communicate that with our catalogers and acquisition staff for when a record potentially would be created.
Thank you.
No problem.
So do other libraries, I'm just curious, do other libraries keep paper copy or digital copy via a form of requests for things that can't be purchased yet? Ariana, I see you nodding. So do you keep like a paper hold form?
They manage it in technical services, but we generally at the desk, we tell people, I'm sorry that we haven't purchased that quite yet, but when we do have a request, I think we sent Jamie, again, if you're listening, when we order things, when a selector puts something into order, in the note field, we put, please put on hold for patron, and then include their barcode. But again, that's not until the item is available for purchase. But I do know people who have, like working relationships, they kind of keep those barcodes and those patrons in mind when those items are coming through. I don't know that we do that for titles that are not available for purchase. I think that's more on the selector side, people who are working with the patrons.
Okay. Any other questions for Violet? Okay, Violet, temporarily off the hot seat. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. The next thing I wanted to just talk about was hold placing practices by holds across CCS. In our discussion last meeting, we talked about like how far in advance do patrons actually place holds? Do most patrons place holds a month before a title's release, or after, or 3 months? So Bob was extremely helpful. He helped me gather some data on our patrons' hold placing practices. So let me just pull this up here. All right. Can you guys see my screen here? Yes. Okay, perfect. So let me just explain a little bit what this chart is of. So Bob helped me gather holds placing patterns for a set of bibliographic records created over a span of 4 months last year. So we looked at records created between September 1st, 2019 and December 31st, 2019. And we looked at then holds activity for this set of bids created, again, over this span of 4 months. And we wanted to see, when are patrons actually placing holds on these records? And so here is the data that we gathered from this. So in this chart, we're showing holds placed before and after an item became available for checkout. So when we're looking at this chart, we can find 0 here, if my shaky hands can get to 0. Yeah, we're right around here for 0. So any of the numbers that are negative to the left, those are holds placed before the title became available for circulating. So in advance of the actual publication date. Now, all of the holds to the right with the positive numbers, those are the holds that were placed after the title became available for checkout. So again, the items are already circulating and they're available for patrons to actually check out, versus again, holds placed prior to while the item is essentially on order. So we can see that here in this chart, the vast majority of holds are placed after the item becomes available for circulation. So we do have a significant number of holds being placed prior while the item's on order, but for the most part, we see that most holds are being placed in the weeks following publication. So you see that we do have some holds being placed as far as 300 days before the item actually becomes available for circulation. But we really don't start to see those holds begin to creep up until like the month or so before the item is released. Any questions about what this chart means? I know it's kind of a lot to soak in as you're first looking at it.
How often, Deborah, how far before publication does a typical record get entered into the system?
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit at the last meeting. I don't have the average. That is data we probably could get for you. I don't have it ready today. It seems like last meeting we estimated that you can pre-order most titles 2 to 6 months before the publication date. And I'm sure it's different, like ordering patterns for very popular titles and selectors and technical services, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I would assume you can pre-order the very popular titles farther than in advance than you would some of the others, but does anyone want to speak to that? No. Okay. And then just to make sure that we were, I wanted a look at some of the maybe the different factors that are affecting this chart. So I did also, Bob helped us break it down into the interface in which the holds are placed. So we have, again, holds placed in LEAP versus holds placed by patrons in PowerPack. And you see that with the holds being placed in PowerPack, again, they begin to ramp up in the month preceding the item's publication date. But we see a peak of holds being placed, a couple days before an item becomes available for circulation, and then in the couple of weeks following. And that pattern was interesting for holds placed in LEAP, but does still roughly follow that same pattern. And we see a very interesting spike for holds placed in the staff client 2 weeks after the title is released, and I'm not quite sure what that is from, but I am going to dig into it and see what that's all about. So I thought that was interesting. And then, we also broke it down by type of bib record to see if there were significant differences in holds being placed on book format versus, holds being placed on AV. But again, we do see that it remains roughly the same even when we account for the type of material. We don't necessarily see a big shift in holds placing patterns for book versus DVD. Does anyone have any questions on this?
I would be curious to know, this is all super helpful. I'd be curious to know how many libraries, like we have a, popular author program where people will just place the holds automatically for people as soon as we can get a record in. So then I'm wondering how much of that early spike is also from those types of programs that libraries offer as well.
And I was interested in that as well, which is why Bob broke it down by interface. So I am guessing that for holds placed in LEAP, some of these early spikes, 170 days before a publication date, those may be from staff who are, again, participating in these popular fiction programs, and staff are actually in bulk placing 70 holds at a time. But again, we only looked at a very small set of bids for this data because COVID's been very weird. So we're like, we want to do pre-COVID because we don't know how that could have impacted holds and ordering and things like that. So we looked at a very small, but I would assume, again, these early spikes that are, 50 to 100 holds are from something similar to the popular author program, all being placed on the same day. So I think what this information can give us is that we don't necessarily see large numbers of patrons wanting to place holds over a month in advance. Because again, we had some questions at the last meeting of what do they want? Do they want to place the holds a year in advance, or do they want, do they wait till they see it on a talk show or in the bestseller list, and that's when they go and place their holds? I'm gonna hop back over to my PowerPoint here. Okay, thank you guys for bearing with me. One day I'm going to be good at this. Okay, and then one of the other things that the group was interested in having were just some sample bib standards. And again, not final versions of what these would look like, but just some an example of what it could look like to the patron and to staff in both the catalog and in LEAP and the client. So we came up with just some sample bib standards, which I shared out with the group a couple of weeks ago. And rather than look at that, I thought it'd be more helpful to look and see what would this actually look like in the catalog to a patron. So here we have an example of what Taylor Swift Miss Americana, again, released in streaming format, not yet available for purchase on DVD. This is what it could look like in the pack to a patron. As part of our draft bib standards that we talked about, we said, you know, of course we would need a title for these records. I don't think, and again, we need to come up for guidelines, but the Swan library that they added, their practice was like the title would be the next James Patterson. I think we can all agree in CCS that that wouldn't be sustainable for us, that we would actually need to have a real title in order to create a forthcoming title record, as well as an author. We talked about how the forthcoming record would need to have the correct type of material applied so that we could minimize issues of what kind of format do these holds need to be transferred to. So we would need a record for a DVD, we'd need a separate record for a Blu-ray, large type, regular print, and so on. So we see that format icon here. We'd want that in place so patrons knew what they were placing holds on in the catalog. We also talked about how we would need some sort of summary that would display to patrons that would indicate to them that this was a forthcoming title not available for purchase. So we input some placeholder example text here. Of course, that may or may not be what we could use. We get feedback again from our catalogers and public services staff if we're to move forward with this. I did receive a question from a library staff member asking about cover art. Like, would it be possible to input cover art into the pack that would say, you know, something like forthcoming or not available yet, or something along those lines? And the answer to that is no. We're not able to import custom cover art in Polaris. We use synthetics for our cover art, and they do need like a UPC and ISBN in order to pull in cover art, and we have no alternate way to force a certain cover image to display. So there would be no cover art for these titles for patrons. We also talked about how staff, like how could we help staff easily identify these kinds of records when they're searching in LEAP or in the client. And so one possible way to do that is to take advantage of the bib call number, which is the 082. This field does display in the hit list by default in the client and in LEAP. So by putting forthcoming title in that field, one, it would easily identify to staff that this is a forthcoming title record, but it would also give us a very easy way to then find these bib records for reports, whether that's for cleanup reports, hold reports, to help us again with that workflow and to help the libraries that might participate identify these. So we thought that was a good field to use, but again, if this is to move forward, we'll have more conversations with our catalogers on these cataloging standards. Then the next thing that the group asked for was a sample workflow. And so I did draft one with the help of CCS staff. And just to give a quick overview of what that could look like is, of course, participating library would add the forthcoming bib record adhering to whatever these standards we came up with were. Additional libraries who wanted to participate would put an item record onto that record, and they would make it restricted only to holds for their patrons. When the title becomes available for purchase, they would actually order it from their vendor, and then they would import a vendor or on-order record, and they would either merge the forthcoming with the on-order record, or they would move their items and their holds over once they ordered the title. We had some discussions with the catalogers on their preference there, and their preference, some libraries set a preference for keeping them separate, like not merging them together, but keeping them separate. And then again, having each library who is participating to transfer over their items and their holds. And then of course, then the library, if they participate in acquisitions, would delete that original forthcoming sort of dummy item record. And then of course, if the item never becomes available for purchase, here we have a slight difference. We'd need to set a standard in which, like a time frame in which we would delete these and clean up the database. At that time, attached items and holds would be deleted by the participating libraries, and the last library to delete their items and their holds would then delete the bibliographic record as part of that process. Again, this is a draft. If we're to approve this today, we need to finesse this. We need to make it more detailed and come up with some guidelines in conjunction with our acquisitions and cataloging colleagues. Okay, I know we had some discussion, but I did also, ready to hear what everybody thinks about this so that we can have a vote today. And remember, just to go back to the beginning of this meeting where we review these different questions and considerations, these questions can help, again, guide our discussion and ultimately our vote today.
I saw the record that the sample record you guys put together. I feel that a great number of patrons are not going to get down as far as the summary and just say, oh, there's new Taylor Swift, click. And so we're creating an expectation by the patrons that they're going to get something new imminently. And I think we talked about this a little bit last time. And the other part of it is, and I'm retreading, but that not all of us are going to have the capacity to be able to participate in this, and therefore are we creating expectations in the patrons that we are not going to be able to provide, because as I said, Zion's not we don't have the manpower to participate in something like this. And so if my patrons see stuff out there and the holds are only available, say, Kate's doing it at Northbrook, and my patrons see it and they can't put a hold on it. I mean, there is they have some experience of that, but it's creating a certain expectation amongst the patrons. And so to me, that's creating a little bit of a negative patron experience, and it's going to create it's going to cause staff members to have to spend time and explain to patrons why they can't get, why they can't place a hold. So to me, there's a lot of negatives here.
And I think that's a good comment, Molly. So when we're thinking about these questions and thinking, how does it affect the patron experience and the staff experience, we're asking you to think, how does it affect your patrons and your staff, but also consortia-wide, how does this impact all of our patrons and all of our staff? A comment brought up at the past group was, this is really great for the libraries who could participate, but for those of us who aren't able to, how does that impact our patrons, and what's the, how does that weigh out consortia-wide?
Can I ask a follow-up question to Violet? You said you have now basically an in-house tracking system where you're able to basically continue to offer the service to your patrons. Can you speak to, I know it's, since you joined CCS, you obviously haven't been adding the forthcoming titles. Has your tech services had success transferring holds for what you had as a forthcoming title to something that is in the database, and therefore your patrons receive that in the hold order that they should have?
Yeah, that hasn't been a big issue. And just to clarify, we do not have something in place to continue this right now. I'm saying I think our public services staff would try to identify something we could do, but we don't actually have anything to replace this right now. So basically right now, we do have patrons that are complaining, and we just kind of have this little script of, we're working on it, we'll see what we can do. We've joined a consortium, and we have to adhere to their rules. We're seeing what we can do. So we basically just keep telling everybody, we'll see. But we don't actually have anything in place currently to replace this. And but yeah, the moving the holds over from the old forthcoming records, it's been a lot of work, but we it's been the acquisitions clerk that's been doing that, and she's very diligent. So that hasn't been a problem. But again, it's, you know, it's a limited thing. It's only our patrons we're dealing with, so I totally understand that this could potentially be a big issue.
I wanted to check and see if word had filtered up to this group how your patrons were handling or what they were encountering when we weren't quite yet sharing out materials with other libraries. I know I've worked our virtual chat and been a greeter, you know, standing guard at the door to make sure everyone's masks are up. But I have experienced and got feedback from my staff that patrons are confused why they can't place holds at other libraries. So I don't know if y'all had experienced that, or if that was maybe a potential new experience if going forward we are cutting our patrons off, or our patrons are cut off from borrowing from other libraries when they can see the items in the catalog. Have you experienced that? No.
Well, we see it occasionally, usually with new items. You know, somebody's trying to put a hold on a new item and going, why can't I place a hold? And then we look it up and go, oh, it's new. This library doesn't allow their new items to circulate for the first 6 months. Try again in a couple of months. And usually there's some minor grumbling, but nobody's outright unhappy. During the current time, I've had some folks even on staff, although they're newer staff, go, why can't I put this on hold? And I'm like, well, that library right now is not participating in interlibrary loan. And I had to put out an email message to all staff saying not quite all the libraries, or they're kind of coming and going. You know, Northbrook just came on, Crystal Lake is leaving. You know, some of that kind of thing is going on during COVID here. And it is confusing even for staff a little bit. I think at least, you know, for those of us who've been in CCS for a while, we have created an expectation in general, if they can see it, they can have it, and they can place a hold on it. Most people will understand, you know, if it's a unique item, you know, we've got some genealogy stuff that doesn't circulate and that kind of thing. So, but if it's a common item, there will, you know, I think we will be, well, I'm trying to think through it all as I'm talking. There will be certainly a learning curve. You know, if we start putting out these forthcoming titles, there are going to be a lot of questions for a while. People are going to go, I want it, I want it, I want it. Why can't I put a hold on it? And, you know, for us, it's going to be because we're not participating in that. And eventually they'll learn. But I don't know. To me, there are more negatives than positives here. it seems to me that it's an 80-20 moment, and we are catering to the 20 and not the 80.
CCS hasn't received any formal input from libraries on whether patrons have been confused by the restrictions because of COVID lately. I will say that the closest thing we have to data that we could chime in with this, when we were doing our Power Pack usability testing, we were at our libraries talking to patrons about their experiences in the catalog, and I observed one session at Morton Grove, and what was really interesting, we did not ask patrons about this, but at the end they got to say, is there anything else you want us to know about this? And one thing they were really confused about was, how do I know what I can have? Like, they very clearly understood that there were differences in what they could get from other libraries. They knew that there were hot copies, they knew that there were new copies and regular copies. They just didn't know how do I know which ones they'll send me? They were very confused about that. And I thought that was interesting because they just told us that unasked for, like, can I get that one? Can I not get that one? How do I know? So I think that is sort of the closest we can get to sort of formal feedback we've received from patrons on, there is confusion, I think, on the patron end on whether they can get something through inter-CCS loan or not. And there's not a really great way for us to help patrons identify that in the catalog.
Harkening back like a decade, when I was the children's services manager at Park Ridge, one of our biggest complaints from patrons was that those jerks at Northbrook wouldn't share their AV items. And it was constant. It was constant. For any of you that were in CCS then, right before, like 6 years ago, before we started sharing our stuff. And then when I got here, I'm like, this is bananas. And then I found out our patrons couldn't even put holds on our AV items. It was browse only. And so I feel like that is very similar to this, of like at first it might be like, well, this is just what's happening. But I do feel that long term, kind of like what Molly was saying, it would have a lot of repercussions that would just kind of grate over time. Like, oh, no, we're not doing that. Oh, no, we're not doing that. Oh, well, no, that isn't actually available. Well, we don't know if it'll ever be available. And I could see that building over time and becoming problematic.
I don't want to discount the fact that there are positives here. To me, it just seems like the negatives are going to outweigh the positives.
I guess I'm curious, because like, and my staff is pretty like, no, don't do this. Is there anybody out there, obviously Violet, you guys want it, of course, that makes sense. But is there anybody else that's like really for it?
I am for it, but Terry, our head of tech, she said if all libraries, patrons from all the libraries can see, that the bib records, and then that's the problem. It's like, it's what Molly's saying, it's going to be more confusing to everybody, I suppose. I will say, though, that I have learned since coming into a consortium, because I'd never worked in one before, that I find that it already happens where there's confusion amongst patrons, because some of the libraries, like for an example, are fine free. So when they come here, because currently we're not, but we hope to be, but anyway, currently we're not. So there's always we get a conflict constantly. It's like, well, why aren't you? Because they are, da 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 da. And it happens in a lot of other ways too. So that particular issue, I don't know, really. That's why I'm for it, because I don't really feel that we have it with a lot of things we do. Not every library does things the same within the consortium, and it causes difficulty for those of us that are not in the same, I suppose, easy service, I guess, because no fines is better than fines, clearly. Nobody wants to pay money if they don't have to. So that's just one of the examples, though. But I think I always look at things of what's the patron driving? Whereas the drive comes from them, and I want to know what their desire is, their demand is, their need is. And that graph you showed, I mean, it shows there is a desire for it, that there would be a use for it. And so in that sense, that's where I stand on it. I say, for me, move on it and do it, and then deal with whatever that looks like as we move along. So that's my view on that. That's my 2 cents.
Algonquin is the other library that is also interested in this. I have heard that they requested it in the past.
Yes, and they are the other library in the survey that said that, yes, CCS should do this. We don't have representation for them here today, but based on that initial sort of probing survey we sent out to see, would you guys do this if we allowed it? They were the other library that said absolutely. There were a few other libraries that said maybe. But it seems like right now there would be probably 2 libraries who would jump right in and start taking advantage of this right away.
So it seems to come down to whether or not we want to be the one consortium that does this amongst all the others that don't, and take on the potential challenges to realize the potential advantages of this for 2, maybe 2.5 libraries that would take advantage of it. Algonquin and Palatine, and maybe Glenview. Karen likes it, but Tech Services maybe not, so they have to have that own civil rule. So is that a good summary? And is there any other discussion on this, or do we want to have a vote on this?
I feel like Jessica was going to say something, but then didn't. I don't know. No, did you? I saw you on mute at one point. Just wanted to make sure that if you had something to say, you had a chance.
No, I appreciate it. My question was to Violet about, while primitive it is, they have some kind of functionality to make this work.
Okay. Do we want to have a motion on this? I think the motion would be the motion should be to allow the implementation of forthcoming title records in our system. And if nobody makes the motion, then it will die.
I'm new to this structure, so be patient with me as I learn. This is very, it's just all very political looking. I make a motion that we allow it.
And I don't mean to be rude. Violet is a member of the committee?
Yes, she is.
Okay. And then do we have a second? We also need a second for us to move on, or else it will die for lack of a second.
A second.
Okay. So we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? Okay. Do we do roll call votes for everything, or can this be a voice vote?
Oh, because we don't have to comply with OMA, right? So.
I think we could
we can do whatever we want to do.
I've got the list up if we just want to do a roll call vote. Would that work?
Roll call vote.
Okay. All right, I'll start at the top. Alex Todd.
No.
Kate Hall.
No.
Karen Key.
Did you say Karen?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Jeff Ray.
No.
Linda Kahn.
I vote no.
Molly Brumbaugh.
No.
Jessica Thompson.
No.
Sarah Kaminsky. Sarah.
Okay, there you are. No, I was already logged off coming over here.
We'll count that as an abstention.
We can't hear Sarah. Sarah, do you want to just type it in the chat?
Thanks, Sarah. Okay. A no from Sarah. Ariane?
No.
And then Violet.
Yes.
The motion failed.
The motion failed.
Okay. Well, sorry for those who voted in favor of it, but I think we had a good discussion. It's very loud in my office where I'm working right now. So is there any other business before this committee?
CCS has none.
Okay. Hearing none, then I declare this meeting adjourned at 10:47. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, for the
Thanks,
great
everyone.
discussion today. I appreciate it.
Happy holidays, everybody.
We'll see you in February.
Yay.
Happy New Year, yeah.
Happy New Year, yeah.
New Year. I'm ready.
Yeah, really.